Well, hey everybody, welcome again. This is a second live conversation, live stream that we're going to be having this week. If you kind of missed it on Tuesday, had a really fun conversation as well, and so jumping into another conversation here on Thursday. And today we're going to be talking about some practical ways in which we can have conversations. Right? Tuesday was how do we talk to our kids about Jesus with Natasha Crane. Now it's kind of how do we talk about to skeptics.
Yes, we are. Well, hey,
and
everybody,
oh my goodness,
again. This is a second.
Why is it
live
playing?
Conversation live stream that
Something
we're
is playing.
having.
Never had that happen before. All right, I accidentally had another window open with the YouTube video, so I went live and started playing. All right, so here we are. Let's try this all again. That's the problem of doing things live. But anyway, so how do we have conversations with skeptics? How do we ask good questions? How do we really build relationships and getting to know people rather than simply just having arguments and fights? And so doing that and joining me to kind of explain and kind of go over some ways in which we can build meaningful relationships and have conversations with people who hold to different worldviews is Tyler Ellis. Tyler, thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a privilege and an honor.
Yeah, so Tyler reached out to me and said, hey, he wanted to come on and do the show because Tyler has a unique story. So he had talked and interviewed 50 different people who hold to different worldviews and really learned a lot through these conversations and ended up getting the opportunity to go on to and do a TED Talk on kind of this topic. And he gave a TED Talk which was originally titled Jesus is Not a Role Model, which we'll get to here in a little bit and talk about that. But they ended up renaming it Finding Meaning in Daily Acts of Good. And so, we're going to kind of talk about that, but mainly what he learned through these conversations and interviews with 50 different people of different religions to maybe help us better know how to ask good questions, how to figure out what people believe so that we can share Christ with them. Tyler has been in lots of different ministry and nonprofits, and right now he's part of a nonprofit, Let's Start Talking, as Associate Director of that. So Tyler, thanks again for coming on, and maybe take a second and tell people a little bit about your history and kind of what you are doing and kind of why this is something that you maybe started or got into, is having these interviews and conversations with people of other religions.
Okay. Yeah, so I did some apprentice missionary work just out of high school for a couple years, and then did my Bible degree, and then I was a college minister for about almost 15 years. Okay. So lots of experience on campuses with students and professors. And then as of the last 2 years, I've been the Associate Director of what's called FriendSpeak, which is under the umbrella of a 40-year-old nonprofit called Let's Start Talking.
Okay.
And so what we do is we train people how to have conversations with internationals who are trying to improve their English. So we have these reading sessions where we actually read the Bible with them. And so it's all about just letting the Word be the teacher, us asking questions. And so I love it. I got into campus ministry because of international students. And there's 1 million in our country right now.
Yeah.
And there's refugees. And so yeah, one of the things I did as a campus minister back at the University of Delaware, was there for about 5 years, was I just, you mentioned, Ryan, arguments, and, when we think about talking to people with different beliefs and backgrounds than our own, a lot of people just don't do that at all.
Yep.
A lot of people are intimidated by it. You imagine that iconic water cooler at work, where a lot of those impromptu conversations happen. And some people just avoid the water cooler altogether because they don't want to be asked a question they can't answer. They don't want to be put on the spot. They don't want to be humiliated. And really that spontaneous conversation area isn't really designed to accomplish something. People that aren't going to change their whole worldview at a water cooler, But when we can take it to a scheduled conversation, away from that spontaneous, and just kind of move it to, hey, that was a good question. What do you say we get together for coffee when we have some time to really dig deep? I'd love to hear what you believe, how you arrived at those conclusions, and, not give you what I call a 10-cent answer to $1 million question.
Yeah.
So, I had this idea to interview a bunch of people. I actually spent about 2 years, so probably an average of 2 weeks for 2 years, I would interview a college student from any of the states, or international students, different religions, professors on campus, and just some fun random ones in there. I think I interviewed a 5-year-old once, and a man who was homeless, and yeah, different religions. And I loved it. So I would take him out for coffee, treat him for coffee, ask him 20 questions in 1 hour, and I would really just ask the questions and listen.
Yeah.
I would record it on my device, and they signed a media consent form, so I could record it and then dictate it. I put it on a blog that I had at that time so that other people could read what their perspectives were. And so it was an amazing experience. It turned into what I call unexpected adventures and discoveries. And I kind of stole that phrase from a book by Mark Middleberg and Lee Strobel that's called Unexpected Adventures. And that's the best phrase I've heard to explain what can happen when you intentionally set aside time to befriend and learn from people who are different than you.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in the TEDx talk, I share some of those adventures. Just basically, I became friends with a lot of those people.
Yeah.
Went camping together, got to introduce s'mores to a couple international students who'd never heard of it. And just having those fun experiences, playing in the snow when this friend from Vietnam had never seen snow in his life.
Yeah.
Going on a spring break trip to Honduras to work at a children's home, and serving pancakes alongside, a Muslim professor and a rabbi at midnight during finals. And then one story, which was quite amazing, was, one night at 3 a.m. I got a call from one of the students I interviewed who was about to attempt suicide. And of all the people she could have called, she called me. And it makes you wonder, like, why'd she call me?
Yeah.
I'm just the guy that interviewed her. But something about that experience and that conversation and the topics that we covered, she reached out, and we were able to track her down that night, and she's alive and well today. She's
Wow.
married, she's a mom, and she's a Christian.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So, yeah, those were some great adventures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a few things that, kind of stick out to me because, well, the first is that you said, it's not just the quick response. It's not just here's the 10-second answer, which is what you often get on social media. It's what you get when you're trying to engage people online. It's what kind of happens when people comment on my YouTube videos, and it's like, I'm trying to explain, but I would much rather sit down over a cup of coffee, right? In fact, if you see on the screen right there, my website, Coffee House Questions, right? This is my entire ministry started with this idea that myself and some other missionaries in the Dominican Republic launched a coffee house where we wanted to have people come in and just be able to discuss issues and discuss questions and sit down over a cup of coffee. And that's how, as you have described, that's how I've always wanted to have these conversations. Yeah. Like, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk face to face. My wife always says, would you say, when people respond on my videos, it's like, would you say that to him if you were sitting face to face? They wouldn't say that if you had to sit face to face. There's a lot of times maybe when it's online, there's that anonymous, hey, they're not going to be able to talk to me, they're not going to, whatever it may be. But, that often does foster these really cool conversations when we can sit down and spend time talking to people. But I love that you also kind of, discuss this idea of, asking good questions. And that often, is also kind of taken, I think, in a different way. For example, my students right now, I just assigned their final project in my worldview class, and it's an interview project that they have to go find someone to interview that holds to a different worldview than them and ask questions. And
Sure.
Funny enough, that same assignment was assigned to me a couple weeks ago in my class on evangelism, where I had to find someone to interview that held to a different view than me. And what was interesting is when I reached out on Facebook saying, hey, because it's a science evangelism class. So it's like, do any of you guys have any friends who are scientists, who are non-believers that I can interview? And I made sure I said, look, this is not to me to debate them. It's not to go on my YouTube channel. This is not for me to try to, convert them to Christianity. It's simply to understand who they are, why they think the way that they do, and what they think about Christianity. And one of the first responses I got was from someone that said, I'm willing to do the interview, just don't get preachy at me.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not. Like, this is for me to kind of ask questions. And so I wonder, how many times that comes from actual experiences, where in their engagements with Christians, it's trying to force Christianity upon them rather than what you said. Let me ask you questions. Let me just sit here and listen to you. So I'm curious, as maybe my students are going out trying to find people, but also people are going to be asking the same question of like, man, 50 people you interviewed. How do you find these people? How do you figure out, like, how do you even encounter these people who then you are sitting down and having coffee with?
Yeah. The 50 people I found, one source was just friends of friends. So, having a campus ministry on a university campus, you definitely have the advantage of ways to meet people. You can go out and have a booth on the pedway, pass out flyers, have a 2-minute survey. But really, you just have activities and tell your students, hey, bring your friends. So I think college students kind of have that advantage.
Yeah.
But even for those people who are not in college, there's people that you see and bump shoulders with every day, people in your family, people in your neighborhood, past friends that you had, and, even conversations that we can have now through things like Skype, and to have an influence on people, even when they're not here to actually share a real cup of coffee.
Yeah.
But, just figure out, like, who is in your life? Who do you know? So there's kind of pooling from people you already have interactions with, and then there's meeting people you don't know at all. So one thing I did on campus was I would email the presidents of student organizations on campus. So you can go to any school's website, click on student organizations, and they may have changed it, or maybe it's case by case, but at the university I was at, they list all the clubs and the officers of those clubs.
Okay.
So I would just start emailing them, inviting them, introduce myself, say I want to take you for coffee. Part of my experiment was to draw their portrait. So that kind of made it fun. And, you can think of ways to make it easy to say yes to. But I think...
And were you drawing during the conversation?
No, I would take their picture, and then I would draw it later, because it actually takes a while to do these one-line drawings that I do.
Yeah.
I wish I was one of those caricature artists. But yeah, so, between the art and the coffee and just them knowing that I'm a Christian and I just want to listen, that really was fascinating to people. Honestly, Ryan, I think that there were a lot of people who said to me, I've never had a conversation like this. I've never had a positive encounter with a Christian. A lot of people maybe don't even have a real friend who's a Christian. And so their perception of Christians is limited to, back in my childhood, it was Ned Flanders, from The Simpsons, and he's just so cheesy. Or maybe their perception is limited to, I remember several of the people I interviewed, one of my 20 questions was something like, hypothetically, if you did find answers that pointed to Christianity being true, hypothetically, what reservations would you have? What would you do? What would hold you back? Or would you just be ready? And I remember several of those students mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
And it's like this tiny church of less than 100 people.
Yeah.
But there's such a squeaky wheel that so many people who don't have Christian friends, when they think of Christians, they think of these examples that really are representative of just your average Christian.
And I think of too, I'm going back and rewatching The Office with my wife, And I can't help but to think every single time, Angela is the Christian on the show, but she is engaged to Andy. She's sleeping with Dwight. She's having sex with him. She is rude. She's mean. She's not a friendly, nice person. And like, but she is the Christian. And it's like, she is the stuck up, prudent, I'm better than you. I'm whole, like that's the attitude that they kind of gave her. And I go, man, I can't help but think every time, we watch that show, it's like, this is the characterization of Christians that's being presented here. And so for someone who doesn't know who Christians are, they have Westboro Baptist Church, they have Ned Flanders, they have Angela from The Office. There's many different examples that are given on, in Hollywood and movies and TV and whatnot that are just not true Christians.
Yeah, so, when I had so many people say to me, this was a great conversation, and I always kind of got a kick out of that because it actually wasn't a real conversation because I was just asking questions and listening.
Yeah.
But what the essence of what they're saying was, this really was a unique experience for me, and I like it and I appreciate it. Sometimes I had people cry during those interviews just by hearing the question.
Yeah.
And so I also had a lot of people say, man, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good question. And it made them want to dig deep to make it a front burner priority in their life.
Yeah, that's good.
Actually, of the 50 people that I had coffee with, half of them wanted to meet up again. And that was one of those unexpected discoveries, was that high a percentage of people would want to continue meeting with me. Some of them wanted to interview me and hear my take on the same questions I asked them. But again, it was just so natural and friendly and humble and respectful mutually.
Yeah.
That we really did make a friend.
Yeah.
And what I accomplished something in that conversation.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear. So you've given one example of if Christianity hypothetically were true, what reservations do you have? I ask a similar question on this show all the time: is if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Yeah. And then the answer is, if no, okay, what reservations? Like what? Why not? In fact, I have one atheist just right before I called you, I was responding to him on another video I did. He's saying, what do you mean by this? Like, why is this a question that you ask? I'm curious, though, what are some of the other questions that you asked during this interview that kind of allows you to learn more about them and that they thought were so interesting?
Sure. So, I love that question you just said, Ryan. Hypothetically, if all your questions had answers that pointed to God or fill in the blank, depending on what their question is, either a lifestyle issue or a belief, what would you do? Yeah. So that really tells you a lot about them. Another question I love is, on what basis do you believe God will or will not accept you into heaven? Yeah. If there's a God and if there's a heaven. So it's a hypothetical question, but let's just say there was a God and there was an afterlife. And, the typical common belief worldwide is that there's a peaceful experience in heaven, and then there's not in afterlife. There's an up and a down, a heaven and a hell, or there's levels, or different stages of reincarnation. Whatever the worldview is, I love that question: on what basis do you believe God will or will not accept you? Because it really exposes the object of their faith. And so that was the major unexpected discovery that my TEDx talk really focused on, that question. And the response, where it was really unanimous, regardless of their age, the country they came from, the religion or worldview that they inherited or converted to. 9 out of 10 people, it seemed, said our acceptance in heaven depends on our performance on earth. And to further surprise me by that was that Christians, that church-going Christians, are not an exception to that misconception. in other words, a lot of the people I interviewed, some of them were Christians or had been, mostly had been. And even outside those 50, I've had lots more conversations than those 50.
Yeah.
I've conducted that question on a survey to probably 1,000 people, church camps, youth groups, churches, campus ministries, and so forth.
Yeah.
And so what I have found is that a lot of Christians and non-Christians believe that, again, if there is in heaven or a hell, that our acceptance into heaven depends on our performance on earth. So the same people who could tell you all about Jesus, where he was born, when he was born, who were some of his best friends, how he died, what happened 3 days later. They could tell you all about Jesus. They have a lot of head knowledge about him. But when you ask those people, why would God accept him, they don't even name his name. But they appeal to, hey, I'm a good person or not.
Yeah.
I go to church or not. God will accept me because I keep these rules. And it makes Christianity just another religion of do's and don'ts with a scale. My wife and I, just a couple of days ago, finished the 3rd season of this TV show called The Good Place.
Oh, that's a great TV show.
And it's all about this idea of, scoring points or losing points. You make a deposit or have a withdrawal based on every little thing you do. And, your motives behind doing it. And, if you score enough points, then you go to the good place.
Yep.
So it's a very extremely common way of thinking. In fact, a lot of atheists that I'm friends with and agnostics, that is their default belief. That's their fallback belief. I remember talking to this guy in Australia on a bus, and he was an atheist, and I asked him some questions, but what if it's true? What if you did have good answers to believe that? He'd be like, oh, well, I'm good anyway because I'm a good person.
Yep.
God would accept me because, I know a lot of Christians who are worse people than I am. I do too. And so it's even among people who aren't yet there in their belief about God, that's their fallback belief. And so really the reason why I entitled my talk, Jesus is not a role model, is not to say that we can't learn from Jesus. Obviously, he's like this ultimate role model. But people kind of come to view Jesus as someone who came to show us how to get to heaven instead of to be the way to heaven. He came to teach some stuff and do some stuff. And if we could just follow what he taught and follow his example, he's our role model.
Yeah.
We can get there by our merit because he's the model that we are modeling our life after. So it's totally missing Jesus and grace. And that actually was my story growing up in the church. And so that's really the essence of what the TEDx Talk is about. I don't want to give away everything because I hope people will go watch it in minutes. But.
Yeah, and the link is down in the description below if you want to go check it out. It was cool, and but I think it's important there. Just today, and as part of my lesson tomorrow, I'm going through the biblical meta-narrative with my high school students in my doctrine class, and we are just finishing up, part 2 of the biblical meta-narrative, which is fall. All right, so we have creation, fall, redemption. Our book lays it out: redemption initiated throughout the Old Testament, redemption accomplished with the death of Jesus on the cross, redemption applied, the work of the church and living it out, and then finally redemption completed in God coming back and making this new creation. And the last part that I feel like I stopped on and spent quite a big time on, because it's interesting in your story in working with international students is that my school is an international school. So the majority of my students are from mainland China, and and are not believers. And that's always funny when atheists comment on my channel and I say that and they go, yeah, right. Mostly non-Christians going to a Christian school. We don't believe you. And my students laugh at it and they're like, do they want to come check it out themselves? But, really hitting the last point of, what do we learn about the doctrine of the fallen is that we are broken beyond self-repair. And how the very nature of that is what makes the redemption process that God initiated all the way back into Genesis chapter 3 with crushing the head of the serpent throughout all of his covenants of Israel in the Old Testament to what Jesus accomplished with his death and resurrection in the New Testament is part of this understanding that you are broken beyond self-repair. Mm-hmm. Because the moment we go, I'm not a bad person, what I did was not so bad, and I can fix myself, or I can work my way there, then why did Jesus have to die?
Yeah.
What is the point of Jesus' death on the cross if you can do enough things to get there and you can fix yourself? And I think it's that issue that, as you're saying, that many Christians don't understand. And maybe it's just hard for us to admit it. Right? To say I am broken beyond self-repair. I am inherently bent towards evil, in my unregenerate state. Like that's a lot. At least and I'm curious on what you would kind of do in the conversations as you would follow up with these people, and what I try to help my students understand is like, we want to be people that never admit we need help. Yet we do it all the time. You go to doctors because you get sick and you need help and you need them to help you. You go to an airline because you need help getting from one place to the next and you can't fly, you don't want to try to swim across the Atlantic. You go buy cars, and we do things all the time where we admit, I can't do this myself. I need help. But for some reason, when it comes to our entrance into heaven and our ability to live well, we think that we're good enough, and we don't understand this idea. Yeah. So I'm curious, in your conversations, are there times where you kind of elaborate on some of these ideas, maybe as they would interview you, on how would you help someone see that heaven is not based on their good works and them simply just being able to do what Jesus did, but it's truly bowing their knee to Jesus and saying, forgive me?
Sure. Well, first of all, we've already talked about how prevalent the belief is across the religions of the world, and even irreligious defaults, that there's a good place and good people go there. And we get that idea because there's so many parts of our culture that works that way, where good performance is rewarded and poor performance is penalized. You could be on a sports team and you're either on the bench or you're a starter. You could be in school where you get on the honor roll or you got to retake that class. I used to volunteer at a detention center, and we'd ask these boys, what can we pray for you about? And they'd say, pray for my phases. Like, what's that? They're like, well, there's phase 1, and then if you're good enough, you advance to phase 2. And you get a little more privileges, and if you're good enough, then you can wear whatever you want or have a little free time. But eventually you are good enough to advance yourself out of that detention center. So they're always praying for their phases. And it's just everywhere in our jobs with promotions. Listen to the average funeral about how, someone died and they were good. And it's in the books that we read. It's in the TV shows we've already talked about. It's in Santa Claus, where this apparent, omniscient, omnipresent being is seeing everything that we do. He's making note of the things we do, and he's making a list and checking it twice to see if we're naughty or nice. And if we're nice enough, we get presents, and if we're not, we get coal. And so we naturally, as children, being bombarded with this assumption all over from every angle, then we project that onto God. We think, God's just like Santa. He sees what I do. He's making his list. And there's this scale that everything is measured on. And
It's interesting you bring that up because that's the exact example that's used in my textbook when it talks about some people have doubts and a rejection of God because they have false beliefs on who God is. And one example is people think God is like Santa, where he's always just looking in on you. And I've even heard some atheists say something to the effect of like, I wouldn't want to follow a God that just is peeping into my bedroom, always wondering, worried about what I'm doing, behind closed doors. And it's like, yeah, that does. If God is this creeper that's always just like watching us, like, ooh, I see what you're doing. Like, yeah, of course. Why would we want to worship him? Right, but that's
Yeah.
obviously not who he
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, we have, Ryan, you talk about our misconception or our presuppositions. It reminds me of a story where, real quick, back to your question about what questions I asked. The majority of my questions, Ryan, were just open-ended. What comes to mind when you think about God? Simple as that.
Yeah.
And I just listen. What comes to mind when you think about heaven? When you think about hell? When you think about the Bible? And that's how a lot of those questions were. But one of my questions was, what comes to mind when you think about heaven? And I remember asking that to a friend on a road trip once who was not a Christian. We were on our way to a church that invited me to speak in Arizona. And my friend, I played racquetball with him, I believe, and he's like, hey, can I come? I'm like, sure. So on our way there, the topic of heaven comes up, and I said, hey, what comes to mind when we think about heaven? And he described the quintessential, clouds and babies playing harps, the eternal boring church service in the sky.
Yeah.
And all these misconceptions of like, I don't know anything, I can't remember anybody, I'm like a moth toward the light, whatever those are.
Yeah.
My first question, in the spirit of Greg Koukl and his tactics book, it's like, yeah, how'd you arrive at that conclusion, And really, it always comes back to, well, I was watching The Simpsons. Man, they're everywhere. Or, the Far Side comics.
Yeah.
I told him a joke. I remembered seeing a Far Side comic. There was 2 frames. And one frame had a line of people standing at the pearly gates of heaven. And Peter is there greeting people, and he's saying, hey, welcome to heaven. Here's your harp. And then the second frame had a line of people lined up at the gates of hell, and there's flames everywhere, and the devil is there, and he says, welcome to hell. Here's your accordion. And so I told that story to my friend on this road trip, and I kid you not, we walk into the church auditorium a little bit early so I could set up my PowerPoint slides, and the worship band was practicing, warming up, and there's a keyboard and there's a guitar, and right in the middle was a guy on the accordion. I said to my friend, welcome to hell.
Yeah.
But that story, I get a kick out of it because it just shows you how we have these pictures of things, whether it's God, whether it's hell, whether it's Satan. And we really should ask ourselves, is it true? How do I know it's true? Where did I get this picture? What am I basing this off of?
Yeah.
And what if I'm wrong?
Yeah.
What if my picture is wrong? It kind of reminds me of Pride and Prejudice, to use a non-Simpsons illustration. Pride and Prejudice, I admit I liked the movie. I read the book. And here the whole story, Jane Austen originally called that book First Impressions. A little fun fact. And that shows her intention behind the book was to capture how people have these first impressions. So you have Darcy and you have Elizabeth Bennet, the 2 main characters, and they meet, and man, their first impression is a bad first impression, and they do not like each other. But their opinions and their conclusions about each other is based on so little. It's based on this first impression, this very shallow surface level knowledge. And as the book unfolds, they get more and more solid information. They meet each other's friends. They learn about the generous things that they've done for others. And slowly their opinion changes to the point that they fall in love. And I think, man, what if that could be us and God? What if we have this first impression of God that is just wrong? No, it's not based on those picketers out on the corner who are saying God hates you, or, Ned Flanders or whatever. But what if I'm wrong? And what if I dig deeper and I give it a chance?
Yeah.
And I let God, if there is a God, I look at those claims, I test him, and I see, what does he say about himself? I met a lot of people who, when they talk about God, they would have some negative comments. But ironically, when I'd say, what comes to mind when you think about Jesus? Unanimously positive.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, I respect him.
Yeah.
And he was a revolutionary, or, he goes down in history with Gandhi and Mother Teresa and, all those good people, that none of us can be like. But, I respect him. And so I loved on those follow-up conversations to go to verses like John 14:9, where Jesus says, hey, if you've seen me,
You've seen the Father.
you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
If you really want to know what God's like, follow me around. Watch what I do. Look at who I hang out with. Look at who I defend. Look at the sacrifices that I make. I am showing you what God's like.
Yeah.
And defying that first impression. And maybe, like Elizabeth and Darcy, we could fall in love with this God who loves us more than we knew.
Yeah, and I think that's just so important, as you mentioned it, of allowing God to kind of speak for himself, right? God has revealed himself in Scripture. And so if we're trying to figure out who God is, that is where we need to go, rather than in these false ideas that we often have. And, I love it because I use the exact same illustration you gave about first impressions in a talk I have titled, Everyone Has to Start Somewhere, where there are people who you know nothing about, and you're not even aware of their existence, and therefore you don't even think about them. But then there are people that you learn about their existence and you don't want to get to know them because you have an impression of what they might be like. And so just because you think they'll be like something, you don't even want to try. And maybe, when I'm giving this to students, maybe some of you are like that with God, to where you have false ideas about who God is, and you don't even want to get to know him based on some sort of impression. And other times there's people who they look amazing, and you're like, that looks awesome. You get to know them, and you're like, oh man, yeah, we are not going to get along. Right? Because we recognize our first impression is not always correct. Now, but also, allowing Scripture to speak for itself. A question came in from Christine that relates to that, and she's asking your thoughts on this. Do you think that biblical literacy or illiteracy is the reason that even some Christians think that being good is the way to heaven? Many Christians only open their Bible on Sunday at church.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Great question, Christine. Yeah, a lot of people don't read their Bible. And, man, there's a verse that I love in Hebrews 12:15. It says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God. And when you dissect that verse, that short verse, in each phrase, and work backwards, what is the grace of God? Who is no one? And what does it mean to see to it that no one misses it? But when among the people missing God's grace, as we've already mentioned, are a lot of church goers in Christian church buildings. One of the statistics I shared in the TEDx talk was a 2019 study conducted by the Barna Group that asked people, do you believe that if you live a good life, there's a place in heaven reserved for you? That was the essence of the question.
Yeah. And
between people who answered somewhat or, yes, absolutely, that was 44% of U.S. Christians said, yes, I'm going to heaven because I'm a good person. That's almost half of the Christians in our country alone. 1 out of every 2 people. I mean, this is prevalent. It's everywhere. So, yeah, I mean, reading the Bible is the most basic starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, that too is just why, and kind of pushing back to other interviews that I've done is just so relates is, the question came up in my last interview with Natasha Crane on teaching your kids about Jesus. It's, there's a lot of people that know the Bible stories, as you mentioned in your interviews. There's people that kind of know the stories and know these things. But when you ask the question, what is heaven like? How do you get to heaven? You ask some of these deeper theological questions. There's a lot of false information that people really haven't taken the time to truly understand who Jesus is, why his resurrection is important, why it matters. And that's something that we need to start even with kids. Now, I am curious, or if you have something to say.
Well, back to this idea of illiteracy and why do people miss God's grace? And I really think for those of us who grow up in it, we already talked about all of the areas in our life and in our culture that are telling us here's how it works, and we project that onto God. But when you're growing up in church, I think Jesus is assumed to be common knowledge. It's easy for pastors to assume that. It's easy for parents to assume that. And so because we assume, oh yeah, they're coming to church, they know that, so let's give the most airtime to stuff that we think they don't know. Or as if I'm in this denomination, I want to emphasize the things that denominate me from everyone else. And so we focus in on our pet doctrines, and when you grow up in that, when Jesus is assumed to be common knowledge, he actually becomes uncommon knowledge. And so we actually put our faith in the things that we hear the most, which ends up being, I'm in the right place, doing the right things, believing the right things, right this, right that, therefore God will accept me because I'm right. And so yeah, we have all this knowledge about Jesus, but when it comes down to on what basis will God accept you, we don't even name his name.
Yeah.
We appeal to our rightness. I mean, that's really the essence of the story of, the tax collector and the Pharisee in the temple. Jesus, Luke 18, I believe. Luke says Jesus told this parable to people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And so the Pharisees in the story represents the audience there. They were people who trusted in themselves. And so the Pharisees appealing to the good things they did, and then they're comparing themselves to people who are worse. It's the quickest way to look good.
Yeah.
To say, hey, I'm better than them.
Yep.
And of course, Jesus makes the tax collector the hero of that story.
Yeah.
Who's beating his chest and saying, God, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner. Jesus said that person went home justified, innocent in the eyes of God, and not the other. So
it's a point that you can't miss when you look at Scripture seriously. I mean, it's just so clear of the woman and giving of, her little copper coin or whatever it was, versus the people giving everything with pride. It's like, Jesus saying, like, you whitewash tombs. You look good on the outside, but you're full of dead bones right on the inside. And just what is truly important in how we live. Now, I'm also curious, in these conversations you had, because the question that came in a couple of shows ago I did on how to talk to Jehovah's Witnesses was kind of, it seems like these conversations kind of just run their course and then die out, right? Versus maybe offer some sort of fruitful, lasting, maybe change or something like that. And I'm curious in your conversations too, because you mentioned how, that what thing that you learn and that you kind of focus on is, the asking good questions, help identify beliefs and barriers and starting points. And so in these conversations, you sat there and you simply just asked questions and you listened. And, I can maybe hear some people going, but they need to hear the gospel. Like, if you're just listening to them and they don't hear the gospel, how could they be saved? Like, what's the point of, of figuring out what they believe and what their barriers are from becoming Christians and what their starting point is if maybe it's not progressing? So I'm curious on, with the people that continued to meet with you and continue kind of that relationship that you talked about, did you see them kind of just die off, or did you see these conversations actually then turning into opportunities to share the gospel or to kind of have more of that change in their life?
Yeah, so of those 50, like I mentioned, 50% of them, so 25 of them, wanted to meet up again. And many of those turned into ongoing weekly Bible studies. And several of them, I studied with them once a week for like 2 years. And so they became good friends. And so half of the people I continued conversations with, which means 1 out of 4 out of the 50, 1 out of 4 people I interviewed actually went on to become a Christian.
Wow.
So 25%. Yeah,
That's
it was
incredible.
awesome. Yeah. So the questions was a great way to get those conversations going, get those friendships going, and encouraging people to really take some significant steps forward to make it a priority in their lives. And so one of the things I like to do when I sit down with somebody is not just ask them questions, but to invite them to ask me questions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you really find what things people are struggling with. And I'll tell you a quick story. So there was this one college student that I met with, and the first time that we met for coffee, this was not part of my 50 interviews, but she said, I have so many questions. I feel like there's no way in the world, if I had 100 lifetimes to live, that I could ever get all the answers. So what's the point? And a lot of times while people are asking questions, I'm praying in my mind like, oh God, help me. I don't know how to answer this question. Oh, that was a really good question, because we can't get all the answers to every question.
Yeah.
So how do I help this person make some spiritual progress who believes that unless you have all the answers, it's irresponsible to draw any conclusions? So what I had her do was I said, hey, go get a little notebook, and between now and next week, I want you to write down every single question you can possibly think of. And she's like, what? I can't imagine. I just got done telling you this is futile. But she did it. And she wrote down all her questions. And then she came back the next week, pulled that thing out of her backpack, and it was just page after page after page. Black ink, red ink, blue ink, upside down, sideways, just this collage of questions and questions and questions. And she said, again, what was the point of that? Now I just feel worse. And I said, well, now my next assignment for you, and this is going to be really tedious, but if you really care, you'll do this. I want you to go through your questions one at a time and ask yourself, how important is the answer to this question? And prioritize them. Number 1 is the question with the answer that matters the most. And then number 2, all the way down to 100 plus. Obviously, does God exist is going to be in your top 5.
Yeah.
Whereas, did Adam and Eve have a belly button? It's way farther down.
Yeah.
So my point in having her do that, and she did that exercise.
Wow.
So when she came back, I had her take her pen and start at number 1 and run down the list. And each time she came to that question, she asked herself, could I ever have a relationship with God without this answer? So, does God exist? Well, no. I've got to know the answer to that question before I can have a relationship with God, obviously.
Yeah.
Number 2, has God revealed himself? Or is the Bible true? And did Jesus raise from the dead? So, had these big questions. What about evil and suffering? For everybody, their top 5 is different. But for her, she got about 5 questions down before she struggled with one. It was like this gray area. It's like, okay, I guess I don't have to know that. And then all of a sudden, what was like 100 questions that overwhelmed her and made her think, what's the point of even attempting to find these answers, was now down to 5. It was just this weight that lifted from her, because she's like, oh wow, I guess I could probably, get to the bottom of 5 instead of 100.
Yeah.
You saying that I don't have to have the answers to all this other stuff to cross that line of faith and have a relationship with my Creator? I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
Some of those questions can wait.
Yeah.
So that was a very liberating exercise for her.
Yeah, and I think that's just so important, just to, with an encouragement, just to, anyone who's listening is, how do we really focus on the basics? And the most important, right? And we can spend so much time, and this is what we talked about in my conversation with Tim Barnett on Jehovah's Witnesses. You can spend so much time to talk about, whether you should celebrate birthdays or not, or whether Jesus was crucified on a cross or a torture stake, or, whether, you should donate blood, have blood transfusions, or how many people, there's 144,000, who are they, and all this kind of stuff. And those are fun conversations to figure out. And there's a lot of fun stuff that we figure out, but really, whether Jesus was crucified on a cross or a torture stick, the fact that he was crucified and rose again is more important. The fact that God exists. And so it is important. And as we go out and have these conversations of being able to say, okay, how big is this issue? Can you trust in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior with what you believe to be true about him? And then, look, I got the rest of my life to dig into these other questions of what I find to be important or not. And then, and also I think it's good to recognize and what I often have to respond to people. And so if, for those questions that come in that are like this is, why didn't God? Now you mentioned Greg Koukle's book on tactics. One thing Greg Koukle says all the time is, when someone says, why did God or why didn't God? He often responds, I probably can't answer this question. Because to answer the question, why did God or why didn't God? Well, I can only know that if God has told me.
Yeah.
Why didn't God create us like this? Well, we don't really have answers to a lot of those questions unless God is saying, here's the reason why I did these things. And so I think a lot of questions that are presented are ones that we simply can't answer. Now, I think we have to be careful not to punt to, well, I can't answer that, when there's questions that we should be able to answer. But then also, what is actually truly important and what is kind of secondary that, hey, that's fun to talk about the age of the earth, but the fact that God created is more important.
Yeah.
And those sort of things. Now, I talk about that with eschatology and all, it's different things of like, as Christians, we should be able to disagree, but center around, mere Christianity. What are the basic core Christian doctrines? Now, I'm assuming that, that this kind of approach is maybe not something that you've always done. You mentioned you've been in ministry a long time. Did you start right away in ministry, sitting down over coffee, asking people questions, or is this something that like you kind of developed later on?
Yeah, I wish that I could have watched my own TED Talk a long time ago. In fact, I was reminded by something you were saying. Here's something I used to do before I actually came to put my trust in Jesus. I would take this approach where, let's just say I met with a Mormon, for example. And so what I would do is I'd get a piece of paper, I'd draw a line down the middle, so there's 2 columns. So on the left side of the page, I would list all the things that I believed they were wrong about, ranging from big things to totally trivial stuff like, can you be an elder when you're not even married and you're 18 years old? Just totally ridiculously trivial stuff.
Yeah.
And so then what I would do is I would try to convert them from the left side of the page with their wrong answers to the right side of the page with all the right answers. And here's the book, chapter, and verse that proves it. And I used to do that. There's this terrible verse, I think it's Matthew, where Jesus said to the Pharisees, you travel over land and sea to make one convert, but you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. It's probably the brutalest thing he ever said, and that really steps on my toes. So what I came to realize was that if a Mormon is lost, what makes them lost? Is it because they're wrong on all these things, or is it because of sin? They're lost because of sin. Same thing for me and you. What makes a person lost is not them being wrong on a list of things. It's sin. And then what makes a person saved? It's not having all the right answers to those things. It's Jesus. And so really focusing on what makes a person lost and what makes a person saved helped me in those conversations focus on Jesus and not all the other stuff. Because what I found is that a lot of people, a lot of Mormons, for example, are putting their faith in that list, that system of beliefs. The object of their faith is often those things they believe and those things they do. And because they're believing and doing it rightly, they are saved. They'll go to whatever level of heaven they're shooting for. And so for me to convert them from one list to another wasn't bringing them to Jesus. It was just revising the list. So they're just as lost as they were before because they still haven't dealt with the sin and put their trust in Jesus. Their trust is in the list.
Yeah.
And so that approach, I think, is common. I've seen it in apologetics books and evangelism books. I did it. I've heard of other Christians, pastors, professors doing that approach. And it's scary because you think of like Galatians 1, 6 through 9, it talks about not preaching another gospel. And we do that when we put things on a list and say, if you can't know God and be saved unless you're right about this, unless you're right about that. You know, you have to be right on all this stuff. So it's Jesus plus this, plus that, plus this, plus that. We're perverting the gospel. So we have to really focus on Jesus. And I do it now, today. I do what I call sharing the premature gospel. So once I ask lots of questions and I invite them to ask me lots of questions, now it's our opportunity to say, hey, do you want to tackle these together? Do you want to go at your pace? Do you want to read books from different perspectives and interview people, you know, and be friends in the process? And for those people who say, yeah, let's do that, then I will actually share the gospel at that point, up front, before we tackle those big questions. And the reason is because I've often found, and this is not everybody, but a lot of times, people don't have the will to tackle those questions when their misconception about Jesus up front is wrong. Up front, when they think, when I look down the end of this journey, hypothetical answers to my questions, if it points to God, I still don't want to go there because that just means that I have to be good enough. I have to clean my life up. I have to be perfect. And that takes the wind out of their sail. There's no motive and incentive to drive them to want that to be true. But when you share that gospel and you dispel those misconceptions up front, and they have these breakthroughs of like, whoa, if that's true, I want that to be true. Let's tackle these questions. Mm-hmm. And it just puts this gust of wind in their sails and makes them want to investigate.
Wow, very interesting. Now we only have just a couple minutes left in our time. You know, you talk about, you know, they have these illustrations that kind of help people make sense of Jesus for the first time. Maybe do you want to share one of those illustrations very quickly? You know, we have about 2 minutes.
Sure thing. So yeah, one of them I call the cockroach illustration. And so I ask people, what would happen if you kill a cockroach? And people say, nothing. You'd have guts on your shoe, clean it off. There's no fee. You're not going to jail. You know, it's a bug. But what happens if you kill a person? Well, the penalty is much greater. The penalty increases according to the value of the one offended. So a bug is worth very little. A person's worth a lot more. Mm-hmm. And so if you offend the bug, the penalty is small. If you offend the person, the penalty is greater. And so if this is the bug and this is me, well, God on this scale, he is infinitely more valuable than we as people. And the illustration is not meant to say that God views us as bugs. The illustration is meant to show that if we're consistent with that logic, and the more valuable the one is that we offend, the greater the consequence, the greater the penalty is, then what happens when we offend an infinitely holy, righteous being?
Yep.
We the penalty is equally infinite.
Yeah.
We can't pay it. There's nothing we can do to satisfy the justice of God. So that's kind of part one of that illustration that's just meant to say, oh man, I can't do anything.
Yeah.
Part two is you draw a column next to God that's Jesus. And he is equal to the value of God his Father. And so because of his equality with God the Father, and because of his sinlessness, that is what enables him to take the penalty for our sins upon himself. And so many times, I know that's kind of a quick version of the illustration.
Yeah.
People can check it in the TEDx Talk. I've had so many people just have these major light bulb moments at that simple illustration when they see not only where we stand with God, but why Jesus' death is so significant, what he actually accomplished because of his equality with God and his sinlessness that would enable him to take death upon himself for everybody, satisfy the justice of God, and open his arms forgiveness to those who would trust in him.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Tyler, I so appreciate you taking this time. Man, it was encouraging to me. And again, just kind of hearing ways in which other people have these conversations and ways that we can really get down to the gospel and help people see the true picture of Jesus. I pray that it was an encouragement to those who are watching just as much as it was encouragement to me. So just thank you so much for what you do and taking the time to have this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then I have all your links listed below. Are there other places kind of what people can find what you're kind of doing and what you're working on?
Yep, btylerellis.com. You can watch the TEDx Talk there and follow me on Twitter.
Cool.
Whatever.
Yeah. I got his Twitter handle right here, and the website is below as well as it was on the other screen. So again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, guys, and as we sign off, I just want to remind you again, hopefully you are encouraged by that, but remind you again, this Tuesday, I'm going to be having a conversation with Dr. Jeff Myers from Summit Ministries. He just came out with a new book titled Unquestioned Answers, Rethinking 10 Christian Cliches to Rediscover Biblical Truths. So that's going to be the topic of our conversation. What are some 10 kind of Christian cliches that we believe, and what are the biblical truths behind it? That is going to be this Tuesday, I believe, at 1 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. So you can subscribe and check out that link as well as the interviews that are coming up. Have a wonderful rest of your day. God bless, and go out and be ambassadors of Jesus Christ, reaching people where they are. God bless everybody.